back to my channel. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe down below. And let's get started on this video. So I will be talking about the Task 1 commentary. But before we get started, I do want to let all of my followers know that this Edtpa is specifically SPED. If you are a special education teacher, then this is for you. Sorry, unfortunately, I don't really know too much about the general Edtpa, and I don't want to give out anything that could be possibly wrong or not true. So for right now, I am just doing SPED only. So if you are a SPED student, somebody who's in graduate school right now, going into their Edtpa, then this is the video for you to be watching. So let's get started. So with mines, the first thing that you're going to do with your student is you're going to fill out a special education context for learning. And this is what it looks like. So you see, you have your one, all these information, ABC, da, da, da. So on this, you're just going to give us some information on your student. You know, what kind of class setting is your student in? Is your student in a 12-1-1, an 8-1-1? Is your student in an ICT? Is your student in a general education class with an IEP? Different things. So what is the child in a city, suburb, town, or rural area? You're going to give some information about the instructional size, the group, if you're working with a group of special education kids. I know with my student, I worked with her one-on-one. You're going to talk about the setting. What kind of program are you in? So if you're in a graduate program and you do tutoring, which was what I was in a graduate program, I did tutoring. So there were certain days that I had to meet with my student twice a week at a certain time. So I just pop that information in. You're also going to talk about if there's any textbook that you use, an instructional program that you're using with the student. So I use the Reciprocal Teaching at Work, and this was a resource that I used with my student because I wanted to work on her comprehension. But I'm going to get back to this book later, but this was a resource that I used with my student. And then you have the back. The back, you're just going to talk about how old is the student? Is she a female? What grade? Is the student ESL? Do they speak any other language in the house? And then, of course, you're going to be taking this information from the student's IEP. So anything that you find in the student's IEP describing the student's disability, list any augmentative or alternative communication. Does the child use a keyboard? Does the student do sign? Any devices, speech generation technology, any of those things? That's something that you want to add if your student uses that. If your student does not, then you don't need to. Of course, you don't need to put that in. And it's describe any behavior management. If there's a behavior management that is on the student's IEP, or if you're aware that the school that he or she goes to and the teacher uses a behavior management plan, you want to include that in there. That's something that you want to include because, hey, you might, let's be realistic, you might have to use that as one of your plan supports with your student. Who knows? But anything that you basically get from the student's IEP, you're taking the time to pull out those things from the IEP and basically just give the person who's scoring your test a general overview of your student and what her disability is, and just giving that information that you can provide. So this part is just a breeze. This is very quick. Now, the next part is deciding out how you're going to do your learning goal. Your learning goal, your lesson objectives, and your plan supports. And I'm going to be honest with you guys. This part, you really have to get to know your student. You really have to think about your student. What is her his or her area of need, and what are their weaknesses? I felt like this part is the longest part to do, like where you have to really use that critical thinking and really sit and think very thoroughly and deep thoughts when you're doing this section. But I also, before I get into it, I also want to let you know, whatever you plan for your student to do that learning goal, whatever your learning goal is, before you get in deep and you're planning out your lesson, you need to do a baseline data. I repeat, you need to do a baseline data. What is a baseline data? A baseline data is basically you create the lesson, you do it, you create the lesson, and you're basically providing it to the student, but you are not assisting them with anything. You want to see what can they do. You're not telling them what they need to do. You just say, hey, this is what I have. Let me see you do it. Let me see what you can do. And then once I get that baseline data, I go back and I analyze it and I say, hey, okay, all right, the student had an issue with here. Now I can continue to go further on and investigate more with my Edtpa because I gave you that baseline data and you were not able to get to that learning goal that I want for you. So I'm going to give you an example, what I did with my student. With my student, her baseline data was she had to use the reciprocal teaching strategies. What are the reciprocal teaching strategies? Reciprocal teaching strategies came from, remember I showed you guys this book earlier. I use the reciprocal teaching strategies at work. This is a great book for you to use for students who are very low on their comprehension, those struggling readers that we have in our class. You can use this for guided reading. You can use this for small group. This is an awesome book, and my professor had referenced this book for me to use with my Edtpa, and I found it so beneficial. Things that you can use with your student. You have a game. This is a reciprocal teaching game that you can use with the kids in small groups. They have pictorial support. You can use like pictures. Then it shows the students how they can talk in conversation if they're doing it in group and thinking about predictions using the I think, the I'll bet, or I wonder if. And then questions. I wonder, you ask those who, what, when, where, and why questions. You have clarifying. If you didn't understand something, how did you go back and use it? And then summarizing just what you read. What was the important parts in that reading? So these were some of the things that I used with my student. So if you have a student who is very low with comprehension or having a hard time comprehending those comprehensive texts that they're starting to read or passages, this is an awesome source to use, and I recommend anyone who is in SPED or even general ed to get this book. It goes from K to 12, a wonderful resource for you guys to use. So I used that resource. So basically, my students' baseline data was we were reading Esperanza Rising. How did I get to Esperanza Rising? So with my student, we were doing a lot of passages from readerswork.org. So a lot of the things that we got from readerswork.org, we worked on long passages, short passages, and it's a website where they have a lot of passages from K to 12 that you can kind of pick out based on what your students like. So we did a lot of those passages where my student had to use those reciprocal teaching strategies, questions, summary, clarifying, and prediction. So we worked on that for a good, 5 to 6 months, where she was familiar, she was using those strategies, and we normally worked. Let's say if we did a prediction strategy, we worked on that for maybe 2 to 3 weeks. It depends, because I wanted to make sure that I had it solid, and sometimes the passages became very tricky for her. And I had to be like, hey, let's probably stay another week. So it all depended on my student. But when we did do a strategy, I normally spent about maybe 2.5 weeks on the strategy. And the following week, I would introduce both of them together again. And she would have to do prediction and questioning together. So that's how I did that. My student was reading on a 4th grade level, and she was a 6th grader. So I knew for sure I wanted to target comprehension. But I wanted to see now, how can she transition from reading those reader's work passages, and how can she transition now to read a passage book, Esperanza Rising, that I think is in between a 5th and a 6th grade level. I wanted to see, can she transition those reciprocal teaching strategies and use them now with a chapter book? So I wanted to challenge her. I didn't want to make it easy for her, but I wanted to challenge her to get to that learning goal that I had for her. So my learning goal for my student was the learner will apply the reciprocal teaching strategies, prediction, questions, clarifications, and summary in order to comprehend multiple chapters of the Esperanza Rising text. So you all are going to receive this task 1 plan and commentary. Here is my learning goal. Then once you have your learning goal, you're able to supplement in those Common Core standards, the ELA literacy ones. You're just going to add them in right here. Then once you do that, you go into your lesson 1, your lesson 2. So for my student, for the baseline, I wanted her to make 4 predictions, 4 questions, 4 clarifications, and at least 4 summaries. Unfortunately, my student was not able to do that. She was only able to make 1 for each. So right there, she didn't successfully meet the goal that I had planned for her. So I was able to move along. And that's why I'm stressing the baseline data, because you don't want to fall into a pit where you do the baseline and your student is passing it like flying colors. And it's like, what? Like, now you have to go back to the drawing board and like come up with something else to do for your Edtpa. You understand what I'm saying? And a lot of my colleagues fell into that pit. So I definitely don't want you guys to fall into that pit. So once you know what your learning goal is and what you want to do, go ahead and see what your student, what your student can do, and then go from there. If your student cannot meet that standard that you have for her, or that learning goal, then you can use that for your Edtpa, and then from there you can create your lessons. So with my student, I had to break it down. So for my lesson 1, I said, with sentence starters and pictorial support, the student will demonstrate the skill of reciprocal teaching strategies by making at least 2 in-depth predictions, questions, and clarifications based on the Esperanza Rising text. That was my lesson objective for lesson 1. Then we have the planned supports. Planned supports is basically about the differentiation and modifications. So what are you using? How are you differentiating your lesson for the student? Now with my student, it's strictly said in her IEP that she used graphic organizers for all assignments. If you see something like that in the student's IEP, automatically that is a planned support, because that's something that your student needs in order to get through the academic curriculum that they have. So graphic organizer was 1. I had sentence starters, pictorial prompts, and teacher verbal prompts. So as you can see, these were my pictorial supports. So I used this with my student for prior knowledge. So if I taught her the day before predictions, she needs to tell me, when you see this picture of a globe, what is it telling you? What does it remind you? When do you use this strategy? Or next, I would say, when you look at the picture questioning, what does it make you think? What's the first thing that comes to your mind when you see a picture like this? So I use these for each one, which I laminated myself. And these were the pictorial supports that my student has to use for all the strategies: predictions, question, clarifying, and summary. So these were the pictorial supports. And then this was my planned supports that I used. As you guys get more in depth into your Edtpa, when you log on to that site, they do have an area where they want to see what was those instructional materials / planned supports. You need to put it in a document just like this. So I used a book, the Esperanza Rising book. This was the graphic organizer that we used. This was, like I just showed you guys, the pictorial support. These were the sentence starters. And if you look closely on my sentence starters, I had the globe. I had the questioning, which you can't see on the side, but I had also pictorial supports also on my sentence starters. And then I had a grow and glow, where she was able to write her feedback and how she did, and I was able to respond back to her on her feedback as well, on how she did for that day on that lesson. So in your planned supports, you're just writing what were some of the things that you used. And it's okay as you go throughout your different lessons if you drop one and you add another one, or if you go continuously and you're using the same planned support. So with my student, when we got to lesson 2 now, I also made it more rigorous for her. As we went through all the lessons, the numbers ended up going up because my goal was for her to at least do 4 at the same time. My student wasn't able to do 4 for each reciprocal teaching strategy, so I had to break it down into smaller parts. So for my lesson 2 now, I said with sentence starters and pictorial support, student will demonstrate the reciprocal teaching strategies by making 3 in-depth predictions, questions, clarifications, and summary in order to explain her evidence and thinking. If you notice in my lesson 1, I had introduced 2 strategies to her. I had introduced predictions and I introduced questions. So she has to remember what prediction is, what questioning is. Then I am introducing to her again clarifications and summary. Now she needs to be able to give me 3 predictions, questions, clarifications, and summary in order to explain her evidence and thinking of Esperanza Rising. So at this point at lesson 2, we're starting to bring all the reciprocal teaching strategies together. And then in my lesson 3, with sentence starters, student will verbally communicate and write about 4 in-depth strategies, predictions, questions, clarifications, and summarizing in order to explain evidence in Esperanza Rising. As you can see in my lesson 3, she needs to be able to do those 4 things. She needs to be able to write in depth. What were those strategies that she used? Predictions, questions, and clarifications. If it was a certain word that she didn't know and there was a sentence in the book that kind of gave her a little bit of an idea of what the word was, she needs to go back and provide me that evidence. How do you know that's what it meant? Why do you think that? So I want her to also question her thinking as well. And then for that lesson, the planned support that I used for her was a graphic organizer, the reciprocal teaching game, and a student checklist. And as I showed you guys in the book, I did use that reciprocal teaching strategy game. And as I go further on into my next video, I will let you know how that game also came about. And then my lesson 4 was with student checklist, learner will monitor the reciprocal teaching strategies to demonstrate understanding of Esperanza Rising. My last lesson was lesson 4 is basically she's just using that checklist now. Because at this point she's learned all the strategies. She's using this checklist now to self-monitor. She's monitoring her own self and her reading. And she has to demonstrate that she understands the text of Esperanza Rising. And if you notice, as I was reading my lesson objectives from my lessons from lesson 1 to 4, if you notice, my language was very consistent. When I said with sentence starters or with student, you want to make sure that your language is the same and it's precise, that you're not switching it up, that you're not using different terminology. If you say with sentence starters, you need to continue to have it out. The only time it really changed when it says with student checklist, the learner will. And that was my last lesson, lesson number 4. But you do want to stay consistent with the terminology. And I know a lot of you are going to ask, how many lessons should you do? Honestly, it depends on you. It depends on you. Honestly, it really just depends on you. I knew that by the 4th lesson, my student would have been good. I wanted to do 4. It was ELA. I mean, hey, you don't really want to do 5. I mean, that's just it's just too much. If you can do 4 and try to condense it and break it down, do that. But it's whatever is easier for you. I would say to go with that and just do that with your student. Also, you need to say in your task 1 planning commentary, they're going to ask about your baseline data. They're going to be asking about they're going to ask you, is your learning goal academic with the student's IEP? If it's not, you need to state that, like based on your focused learner student IEP, the learner, da da da. It's not related to her IEP, but you can say the planned support that you use is related to his or her IEP. Like with my student, it wasn't with my student the learning goal was not aligned with her IEP, but the planned support that I used, the graphic organizer, was aligned to her IEP because that was something that she needed and it was stated in there. So you need to find research on graphic organizers, why students use graphic organizers in their learning, and you also need to explain in that part all those planned supports that you use with your student. Like for example, I use the graphic organizers, the pictorial support, the sentence starters, the checklist. You need to explain why you used each of those planned supports and explain them in detail, full out detail. So for example, I said graphic organizers have been suggested as tools educators can use in order to facilitate critical thinking and prepare students for independent learning. So if you find anything research based that talks about graphic organizers, you need to put that into your prompt, into the brackets. You're going to put all that stuff. So you're going to talk about why did you use the pictorial support. I use the pictorial support has prompts to associate with the reciprocal teaching strategy. So when she saw the pictures of questioning, she automatically knew, okay, I know what questioning is, and I also used it to activate her prior knowledge to see if I put this sign up, can you tell me what it is without me having to tell you? So it was also to activate her prior knowledge, and it's important it's important for my focus learner because it helps her to make those connections, to make those new information that she will be learning in the lessons. Like I told you, my student had an auditory and processing deficit. So I wanted to use everything, like the graphic organizers, the pictorial support. It definitely made a difference and it helped her as a learner. So that is what your task one planning commentary is. Basically, you're going to be planning out the lessons for your student. You're going to think of that learning goal. You're going to plan your lesson objectives, and then you're going to think about what are those planned supports that you are going to use for your student. And you don't have to think of your planned supports as being creative, over the top, nothing. No, you don't have to do that. If they have it in the student's IEP, you're going to use that and plop that right there, which was a graphic organizer and, sentence starters, anything, of that sort of what I just said. You can use that in your plan supports, and you can use it across all of your lessons depending on your student. That's what you're going to use. That's what you're going to use. What else? Then you also need to explain. Okay. Then you need to explain basically what is your learning objectives. What are you going to be using with your student? So you said the graphic organizers. You're going to explain what are some of the things that you're going to be using. How is your lesson going to be designed? We know that some teachers, what they do in schools is they use the gradual release model. Now, the gradual release model is the I do as a whole, we do together, then you do independently on your own. So that's what I was basically doing with my student. I do, we do, and then you do. She would do it independently. And it's just a model used for responsibility. You want the child to have ownership in her own work, and you're not over her, giving her instructions. You want to see how she can do it together, where you give the verbal prompts, then we do it together, then she tries it on her own independently. And then you want to get some research based on what gradual release model is. So everything that you're stating, if you're using certain prompts or you're talking about a research based thing that you used in your writing piece, you need to state that. You need to go back and use that, because if you notice, as we get further on in the rubrics, they do talk about that research-based intervention. What did you use? How does it work? And how are you using this with your student. You really want to think about that as you're doing this. Just really, like I said before, this was the hardest part. Not only, I wouldn't say it was hard because I had to go back and forth with the drawing board, but I feel like once you know what you want to do and it's precise after your baseline data, then you're good. But I feel like when you're doing your task one planning commentary, this is going to take the longest part for you because you really need to sit and think. You have to think about every little thing that you do. Why are you doing it? What's the reason? Why? Like, give me more information. What does research say about this? Is it really good? Is it not? If it's not, bloop, something else. So I hope with this video, you guys can take a lot of information out from this task one. The best advice I can give you on this is plan to the T, but take the time that you need to really plan out a successful lesson, a successful learning goal that you know that your student can reach, and break it down into not simple steps, but break it down, but also make it very rigorous for your student so that she will be able to reach that learning goal by you breaking down each one of those things that you wanted to do, each one of those steps that you wanted her to do, him or her, for each of those lessons. If you guys have any questions, any comments, any concerns, I want you guys to leave that comment down below, and I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Until next one, I am going to be talking about the task 2. Thank you guys for watching my video. Bye.